ASL interpretation available on our screen, and we also have Spanish translation available that you can turn on by clicking on the little globe in the bottom right of your screen. So again, we're just waiting for a few moments before we get started, so hang tight, and we're so excited that you're all here tonight. Also, if you have any questions, make sure that you drop your questions in the Q&A box. There's a Q&A icon with a question mark in the bottom of your screen. If you click on that icon, you'll be able to share any of your questions, and we have ACLU staffers working around the clock to make sure that your questions tonight are answered to the best of our ability. So again, we're going to give it 1 or 2 more minutes. I see over 1,000 folks have already joined the call, which is incredible. We're so glad that you're all here tonight with us. Thank you so much for sharing your Tuesday nights with us. Asha, how excited are you for this training to get started?
I am so excited to talk about authoritarianism and democracy and how we can get from one to the other. It's going to be great.
Yes, amazing. Again, just waiting 2 more minutes for folks to join. And while we're waiting, you can drop any questions you have that are on your mind tonight into the Q&A box that's in the bottom right of your screen. Make sure that those questions are in that box so that our folks can answer. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So first, again, I want to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to the ACLU's Organizing to Protect Democracy training. We're so glad that you're here. Please note again that we have closed captioning available. To turn it on, click on the CC icon in the bottom of your screen and click Show Subtitles. If you have any questions, make sure that you use the Q&A function on the webinar. And with that, let's go to the next slide. Awesome. So again, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. Before we get started, I just want to give our Spanish interpreter, Liz, a moment to explain how to turn on translation. So Liz, if you'd like to come off mute and explain that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Liz Torres, and I will be your Spanish interpreter for today. If you need Spanish interpretation, you can go to the globe icon once it appears on the bottom of your screen, or you can click through the More menu and select English or Spanish channel, and you in the Spanish channel. Si usted necesita interpretación al español, por favor, en un momento que aparezca el icono del globo terráqueo inglés o español para que pueda escuchar traducción. O si no, si usted está en un teléfono celular o en un aparato portátil, puede tener acceso por el menú de más, que son los 3 puntitos, y allí puede seleccionar inglés o español. Okay.
Thank you so much, Liz. We are starting interpretation now. All right, so let's get started now that we're all situated and comfortable with the logistics for tonight. So we can go to the next slide. And we know that we're taking action across the country. Thousands of us, many of you who are on this call today, took part in the No Kings protests that happened across the country on June 14th. This was one of the largest protests in US history. And when we were at that protest, we learned and we knew that we needed to keep that momentum going. And so that's why we're here, because we know that as a movement, the only way we can seriously challenge these threats to democracy is by doing the work and educating ourselves and learning how to resist authoritarianism and leverage the power of nonviolent resistance to defend democracy. So that's why we're here tonight, and I hope that we're all setting intentions tonight as we go through this training so that we're learning and we're understanding and we're growing together. We can go to the next slide. So just a quick agenda run through to know what to expect tonight. We started with welcoming and just doing some grounding. We'll walk through setting the stage of where we're at right now. Then we'll talk about what authoritarianism is and what it looks like in this country. Then we'll talk about democracy Then we'll start thinking about how to define people power. What is people power and how do we build movements together? Then finally, we'll walk through ways that you can take action, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for Q&A to answer any of your questions live that we're able to. With that, I'll pass it over to Asha, who is our incredible trainer for tonight, to walk us through this training. Asha, take it away.
Thank you, Attiya. We can get the next slide, please. Good evening, everybody. My name is Asha. I use she, her pronouns. I know some of you today coming from Minnesota and Colorado and all over the place, so welcome. I am an organizer with the ACLU, and I'm very excited to be leading us through our training this evening. And I want to emphasize that tonight's training is just part one of our Organizing to Protect Democracy series, which is a really amazing curriculum that we're taking across the country in person as well as online. So I think some of you may have even joined us in Miami or in Michigan as we've worked to make sure that all ACLU supporters have the skills and the tools you need to organize in your communities. Tonight is the very first time we're doing it virtually, so we're really grateful and excited that you all joined us for this really exciting and important experiment. You can all say that you were the first. And so tonight, like Attiya said, we are going to work on understanding the lay of the land, really, and get on the same page about authoritarianism and democracy. But just know that this training is just the beginning, and we hope to see you at future sessions. We're going to have 3 more in the next few months, where we'll really going to get more into skills you can use in your communities to organize. So tonight is kind of laying the Zoom webinar with thousands of people and participatory, but we're going to do our best. So we've got a statement up here, and we're going to launch a Zoom poll. So my folks who are helping out with the tech, you can go ahead and launch that poll whenever you're ready. And I'd love for you to indicate that's on the screen here. And so the statement is, in the United States, we've seen. So 1, if you put 1, that means you totally disagree with this statement. Like, no, authoritarianism has never happened here. Thank you very much. 5 means, yes, it's happened in full force. So this is not like a right or wrong answer, but we want folks to just go ahead and enter what you think. You should have a pop-up on your screen. Select the answer that feels right to you. And if you can't use that poll function, that's okay. Just make maybe a mental note of your answer, write it down in your notebook, and you can see how it compares to others on this call. So let's go ahead and make sure everybody gets a chance to enter in their response. I'm getting over 1,000 people already responding. That's amazing. We're so glad you're here. And to my amazing team, when you're ready, you can go ahead and share the results of the poll so we can all take a look. Boom. Okay. Wow. Look at that. Like participatory science or something. I already feel like this is a great experiment. So we're seeing that a lot of folks, so around 31%, that was our highest level, gave it a 4. And then we're seeing some folks all across the spectrum. There's definitely some folks who don't think we've seen this at all. There's some folks who are like, yes, we've been here. So that's great to know where we are, where we're all starting off with. And once you've taken a look at that little poll, you can go ahead and X out of it when you don't want to see it anymore. And so from the ACLU, we'd argue that we've definitely seen some features of authoritarianism before in the United States. And in fact, many of the civil liberties and rights that we all enjoy today, or that many of us have enjoyed over the last several decades, were really hard won by social and political movements that resisted oppression and abusive power in different forms in the past. Okay, so some of the civil rights that we have enjoyed that we want to defend are a direct result of people resisting features of authoritarianism in the United States before. Okay. So that brings us to our next statement. So if I can get the next slide, please. It's about resistance and movement building. Okay, so this next statement is the other one. Same thing. So the statement is, I think protest makes a difference. So go ahead and enter 1 if you don't think protest makes a single whit of difference, okay? And 5 is for people who think protest is the answer. The answer, okay? Awesome. Let's see, and folks can go ahead and launch that poll when it's ready. Yeah, great, thank you so much. So give it a think. Does protest matter? I think protests make a difference. Yes or no? Amazing. This is our first time using a poll in an ACLU training, as far as I know. So we are all doing amazing. Thank you for participating. I'm seeing the results flowing in. We'll give it just a few more seconds here for folks to input your answers. I know for some of you who may be joining via your phone, it's a little tricky here. So does protest matter? Yes or no? All right, let's go ahead and call it and share the results. Wow, we got 1,400 responses. I mean, that's pretty good for Wednesday night. Is it Wednesday? I think so. All right, so, and the results here kind of are showing, it's kind of like a linear slope actually, where almost the majority of percent, so 47% of folks think that yes, protest is the answer. We've got variation, right? It's great. We need everyone, we need all sorts of forms of resistance. And I will say most of you on this call did participate in the King's protest. That's where we got our outreach list. So I'm not too surprised that many of you believe that protest matters, right? Because maybe you've actually felt that amazing feeling of being in a big crowd of people, speaking up for what's right. At the ACLU, we definitely think that protest matters alongside a bunch of other tactics to advocate for change. And we're going to talk a lot about the role of civil resistance today and different forms that it can take. But, even if you don't think protest is the answer, we're all here today because we recognize the importance of saying no together in a unified voice. We're here because we cannot stand to see our neighbors targeted, because we won't stay silent while free speech rights are threatened, because we know what's at stake for all of us, and we know that dissent in these times is essential in the form of protest, but also other forms of collective action. Okay? All right. That brings us to our final statement. So can I go ahead and get the next slide, please? This is our last poll question here. So this statement is, we can stop authoritarianism. I want to know if you feel like we, as a collective, as a society, as a country in this moment, have the ability to protect our democracy. All right, that's the poll question. So go ahead and enter in your response. Again, 1 is really no, I'm not feeling it right now. I'm not feeling the hope. 5 is 110%. We can stop it. We are stopping it. Awesome. So give it just a few more seconds here for folks to answer that question. Awesome. All right, let's go ahead and share the results. Woohoo! Okay, so we got lots of responses again. Okay, and we're seeing again this sort of like linear response. So there's definitely folks all across the spectrum with how do you feel. And let's hope that if you're not feeling hopeful right now, by the end of this hour, you'll feel a little bit more hopeful, okay? Because we're going to tell you that we believe that we can stop authoritarianism. We can protect our democracy. And in fact, we can build an even better, healthier one than we've ever had before. Thank you so much for participating in that poll experiment here. And so I just want to, close out with a little activity by saying, we definitely feel that there are many examples of communities and nations fighting off authoritarianism and reversing course when governments start to slide into authoritarianism. And we are actively studying those movements and learning from them. What we've been learning is that in order to be successful, history tells us that we need to grow the size and the power of our movement. We need our friends, our family, our neighbors, our teachers, our doctors, I can't think, our moms, right? We need all of us involved. And if you're here tonight, I know you want to meet this movement. So let's go ahead and start talking about how we can move forward. Zach, can I have the next slide, please? Awesome, thank you. So we're gonna start with some vocab, right? Let's just get on the same page about terms. So first, what is democracy? Well, first I'll say there's a lot of books written about this. Maybe you've read them. It's a contested topic, but in simple terms, I think most of us have probably heard that a democracy is a government for the people, by the people. And what we'll add here, just as an important caveat, is a government for all the people, by all of the people. Okay, those little bits have been forgotten occasionally, right, throughout history. So that's what we'll add here at the ACLU. And in simple terms, a democracy is a governing style where leadership is elected with limits on their power as defined by a constitution. And in a healthy democracy, individuals' rights matter, as do laws, right? So there are checks and balances and systems of power that prevent just one individual or maybe a small group of individuals from having outsized influence. Okay, awesome. Next slide, please. So then what is authoritarianism? Okay, I'm really happy I said that word correctly. If I say that word correctly for this entire presentation, I'm gonna buy myself an ice cream after this. It's a long word, but it's not too complicated. When we say authoritarianism, we're talking about a form of governance in which power is highly concentrated in the hands of a small group of people who act in ways that are out of line of the Constitution and who maintain power through repression and threats and even acts of violence. So a couple characteristics that maybe, unfortunately, will sound familiar to us are that authoritarianism often initially emerges in legal means, so by democratically elected leaders, like through discrediting elections, for example, just to give a random example there, okay? And in addition to a concentration of power in the hands of a few, and Zach, can I go ahead and get the next slide, please? And under authoritarianism, power is maintained by the repression of opposition. Okay, I'm going to say that again. The repression of opposition. And the supporters of authoritarian regimes are mobilized into unquestioning obedience. Maybe that sounds familiar, right? We're seeing unquestioning obedience. All right, and next slide, please. And there's several key features to watch out for when we're thinking about an authoritarian regime. Great, thanks, Zach. So the first that I want to mention is a limited exchange of power between everyday people like you and I and the dominant political powers. In a healthy, functioning democracy, everyday people are not only accountable to institutions, elected officials, but also there's an equal exchange, right? Elected officials and institutions are accountable to the people. So it goes both ways in terms of accountability. In an authoritarian government, that exchange breaks down. Okay, so that means that there is not an exchange of power between everyday people and dominant political powers. Another feature of authoritarianism is that policies based on emotional appeals are used to justify abuses of power. So supporters of an authoritarian leader are made to believe that immoral or unjust actions on behalf of those in power are actually justifiable because they will combat social problems. So this is often used to justify poor treatment of marginalized people in authoritarian regimes. So supporters of a regime are taught to fear certain populations of people. Does this sound familiar? We're taught to fear certain populations of people because of a moral panic by authoritarians and their allies. I'm sure if we could all, several thousand of us come off mute right now, we could probably come up with a lot of examples of this, right? Of certain populations that we're seeing are demonized. So these moral panics position these people as harmful to society in a way that justifies overreaches of government power. Well, so sorry, they're so dangerous. We just have to extend our power. We just have to deploy the military. Have you? A third feature of authoritarian regimes is that they often feature suppression and repression of anti-regime activities or resistance, right? That's that repression of the opposition we were talking about earlier. Now, what does this look like? That's a lot of kind of fancy words. What this means is sending cops to protests, criminalizing protests, punishing opposition party members. We may have seen some arrests in the news lately, like we're literally arresting opposition party members of the political party that's in power. Another example is threatening or enacting violence against those who act against the regime, those who oppose that dominant political party or that dominant leader. And then the fourth feature I'll mention is that executive power is often confusing and inflexible while at the same time being far-reaching. So many of us may have asked ourselves for the past 6 months or so, hey, I didn't realize the president could do that. That doesn't seem right, or that doesn't seem allowed. Yeah, so that's a really common feature of authoritarian regimes, right? Where it's confusing what they're allowed to do, and they're doing a lot. Okay, next slide here. So let's talk about another term. So when a democratic society or one where citizens have a voice in the governance of their country shifts into authoritarianism, so right, so when we from that democracy we talk about into authoritarianism, that shift is called democratic backsliding, or that process is democratic backsliding. All right, so if a democracy starts to backslide, there's a high probability that authoritarianism will break out. Unfortunately, so we looked at the research here, and we're going to talk more about democratic backsliding and what we can do throughout this presentation to try to stop it. But unfortunately, we know that in most cases of democratic backsliding, if we're looking at recent history over the last couple hundred years, authoritarian regimes do take power at least for some time. So that brings us to the next important question, which is who's involved? Thank you for that slide. So we've gotten on the same page about terms. So let's talk about the key players in these various forms of governance who we can potentially influence. So there is an aspiring dictator and their allies, of course. Another name for that figure is the demagogue or the authoritarian leader. However, it's really important to remember that they are not the only player on the field. I don't play sports, but I'm going to pretend I do. I hope that metaphor landed. They're not the only one out there. There's a lot of other folks trying to get the ball, ? They aren't the only form of institutionalized power. Democracy is composed of state and local governments, of federal workers and civil servants, the courts, political parties that oppose the aspiring demagogue, and civil society. And what is civil society, you might ask? That is us, my friends, right? That's everyday people like us who don't fit into those higher up bullet points, but who make up the majority of the US population. And so I want us to all think of ourselves as an essential player, as a key player when we're thinking about democracy. All right, let's go ahead and have the next slide. And so in order to fight authoritarianism, everyone but the aspiring dictator has to be on the same team. Going back to that field metaphor, right? Let's call us Team Democracy. If we want to win, we have to be a team. So we have to make sure our federal servants, our courts, our state and local governments, our elected officials, and society at large, including us, remember, that we view ourselves as being on the same team, and that team is those who support democracy. We all have to work together, even if we're unlikely allies to defeat an aspiring dictator. Even if we don't agree on the issue, we agree that we don't want authoritarianism and that we value democracy, right? It's a common principle among team democracy. We don't have to agree on everything, but we have to agree on that. So can I go ahead and have the next slide, please? And so let's try to understand the strategy of the opposition here, of the demagogue. Remaining unified is incredibly important because it disrupts the goals, strategies, and tactics of this aspiring demagogue to attain consolidated power. For an authoritarian leader to reach that goal there of absolute power, there are a few strategies that they use. First and foremost, that strategy really relies on keeping the rest of us divided. And if team democracy is divided, we remain distracted and fighting with our teammates, fighting over the water bottle. I'm not sure. I don't know sports, but they keep us divided and fighting instead of focused on protecting democracy. And so the aspiring dictator will pick off one member of a team at a time, right? Through strategic threats and actions, and then move on to the next. They'll divide and conquer by sowing division between different communities, between different players that are within team democracy. And they'll use threats to scare institutions or people into submission. They'll sow confusion, like we talked about earlier, and distract from the actual threats to our democracy by creating an environment of chaos. I don't know how you all have felt, but it's been chaotic, right? And then lastly, it's important to mention that they will provoke opposition violence to legitimize their own abuses of power. So this is a common feature that we see. All right, next slide, please. And so that's the overall strategy. So let's talk about some specific tactics that authoritarian regimes tend to use in order to advance these strategies. So President Trump has already told us that he plans to act like authoritarian leaders. He's been open about that. So we'll use example we've seen from the current administration here. The first one is directing investigations against critics and rivals. So within the first few weeks of President Trump's second administration, we saw threats against major law firms that had previously represented clients who opposed Donald Trump. We saw law firms that obeyed preemptively with the administration. Those were some. And then there was another category of law firms who did not, right? Did not preemptively obey. And what we're seeing now is firms who stood up against the administration have been defended by the courts. Those firms who complied are actually losing clients. Okay, so moving on to the next tactic, it's pardons, sorry, that same slide. Pardons to license lawbreaking. So we've seen President Trump give multiple pardons that are clearly about allowing lawbreaking in instances that benefit the administration. So this includes pardoning January 6th violent insurrectionists, which really serves to embolden MAGA forces. Another tactic is regulatory retaliation. So we've seen a kind of chaotic wave of announcing and implementing tariffs that have had some major impacts on the stock market and implied financial manipulation. So this use of tariffs is an example of regulatory retaliation. They're a regulation that is being used for political purposes. The next tactic is domestic deployment of the military. Unfortunately, very recently, we've seen domestic deployment of the military to aid ICE, Federal Immigration Enforcement, in the detention of immigrants, as well as deployment of the military to attempt to squash protesting efforts. Many of us, I'm sure, watched what happened in LA a few weeks ago. And then another tactic I'll talk about is federal law enforcement overreach, which is related, right? So President Trump has declared that immigration is, quote, poisoning the blood of our country, unquote. And at ACLU, we're really worried about this, right? We feel like this is a foreshadowing of how he may act if he invokes the Alien Enemies Act, which is a wartime provision that dates back to 1798. And if and when President Trump has that power, he has also expressed his desire to expand the footprint of federal law enforcement to the extent that they could police cities and shut down lawful protests, right? So this is an example of overreach of federal law enforcement. And then the final tactic I'll call out here is that the autocrat just won't leave. All right, so I don't know if any of you have seen this, but President Trump is currently selling merch on his website that is branded Trump 2028. It's not a joke, and it's really normalizing the idea of a third term. All right, let's go ahead and move on here. And so I know we can't all get off mute here, but I invite you at home to warm up those vocal cords and read this quote out with me out loud. This is not normal, and we are not powerless. I hope you did that with me. So that was a ton of information I just shared with you. And I want to acknowledge that it might feel this, but that is exactly the kind of feeling that we have to resist here. That's the feeling an authoritarian regime wants civil society to have in this moment of democratic backsliding, right? And the reality is our work matters, our resistance matters, and we know what we need to do to build the strength of team democracy. So let's go ahead and have the next slide. So how are we going to fight back? We mentioned before the importance of playing as a team, and you saw before just how reliant authoritarianism is on strategy of divide and conquer. So we need to resist that. And to resist being divided and actually unite as team democracy, we need to cultivate solidarity. That's the cure, right? To divide and conquer, solidarity. We have to find ways to have common ground. At a base level, it can be wanting our country to remain functional. We need to think strategically about all the identities that we have. Maybe we're a parent, maybe we're a teacher, maybe we're an alumni of somewhere, maybe we're a worker. And we need to maximize those spaces that we operate in and organize with other folks there, through this lens of finding common ground. And we have to resist the urge to preemptively obey. Right? We talked earlier about how we've seen some institutions and companies pre-comply. But we've also seen entities resist compliance and be protected by our court system. We have to make use of multiple channels, institutional and non-institutional, to organize within. So maybe it's my university today, but it's also my friend group that watches Love Island every Friday, whoever it is, right? We can organize where we're at. Next slide, please. Thank you. We have to build broad coalitions, both with folks we're used to working with, as well as folks who might have a very different position. Maybe that friend group who I watch TV with, I have a friend there who we don't normally talk about politics, right? We have very different ideas, but we may both agree that we need democracy, that we want to be on team democracy. So we have to flex our muscles to participate in unified rapid mobilization. That's another thing. So many of you are here from the recent No Kings events, and that No Kings Day was awesome, right? It was this great example of us flexing this muscle of mobilization, of getting out into the streets when there was a call to action. But we also need to be able to do that with less notice, right? Maybe it's a few hours notice. Maybe it's not on a weekend. Maybe it's inconvenient, right? But it's going to be critical to prevent or reverse democratic backsliding, especially when there are peak moments where we need to take action immediately. And another point I want to emphasize here, and this is, back to the previous slide. Thank you, is that we have to remain nonviolent. And as a note here, it's important to note that what constitutes violence can be very different depending on our identity. So, for example, during the 2020 movement in response to the murder of George Floyd, there were peaceful and nonviolent protesters who were then painted by the news as violent rioters and by some politicians, predominantly because of the involvement of Black and Brown folks relying on legacies and present-day structural racism. But we bring up the importance of remaining nonviolent for many reasons, but one I'll share with you today is that research has shown that movements where we remain nonviolent, even if our opposition engages in violence, are much more effective at reversing the course of democratic backsliding. I actually just read a study about this before this call. It's really interesting, right? But nonviolent movements are much more effective. They're much more attractive to that broad swath of team democracy, right? So it's a really important key feature to keep in mind. And on a personal level, we have to avoid despair and dropping out, even when our efforts don't lead to immediate success. So I know many of us on this call may have been involved in lots of advocacy last week leading up to that big legislative decision in Congress. We might be feeling upset, rightfully so. And we can't think of this as the end of the road. Each of our fights makes us stronger, brings more people into our movement, and we need to keep up that energy to organize in order to get to the size that we need to get to. All right, and that brings me to my next slide here with the fun fish. So let's talk about people power. People power means everyday people working together in political, economic, and social power so we can create systems that benefit all of us, bringing us back to that. So many different things, right? But it helps us have the impact necessary that we need to reverse course, to defend democracy, and to build a better democracy once we do get that regime change that we're looking for, right? You know, defeating authoritarianism is not the end of the road. Building a healthy, inclusive democracy is. And we need people power to do it. So how do we know building people power actually matters? Let's go to the next slide. Going back to the social science, we can see that in instances where democratic backsliding occurs, our resistance is more important than it has ever been. So we discussed earlier how I think it was on the slide, how 68% of countries that experience democratic backsliding do fall into authoritarianism. This is based on a study of social movements between 1900 and 2006. I think it was like 323 instances. And the major hope for reversal in these situations is active resistance. So countries where resistance occurs have a significantly higher chance of stopping democratic backsliding. So the study found that another study, found that in 35 cases of backsliding, when resistance did not occur, there was only a 7.5% chance of stopping democratic backsliding, compared to a 51.7% chance when resistance did occur. And in this study, that resistance was defined as, a few thousand people being involved for at least a week, right? So it's doable. And even when authoritarianism is fully in place, so democratic backsliding is over, we're in authoritarianism, resistance was found to be critical to reversing course. So 46% of countries that fell into authoritarianism were able to reverse course when there was resistance. That's some good news. Go ahead and have the next slide. And social movement scholars have found that when 3.5% of the population participates in a nonviolence resistance moment during a peak event, so maybe that's a constitutional crisis, authoritarian governments have historically backed down. And that's from that study studying the 323 movements from around the world. It was a clear threshold level that when you get at least 3.5% of the population involved, that tends to lead to a regime change. So in the United States, what does that 3.5% translate to? Any math majors out there? It means we have to be prepared to mobilize 11.9 million people. 11.9 million people during a peak moment that calls for resistance, right? So that's a rapid response action, right? That's a constitutional crisis. That's a day where we need to be out there and show that team democracy is not standing up for this. And thinking back to June 14th, so that was the No Kings Day, more than 5 million people nationwide rallied. There was over 2,000 actions across the country to condemn President Trump's escalating abuses of power. And that wave of protests was the largest mobilization that we've seen since President Trump's return to office. It was an amazing show that people across the nation will not be intimidated by President Trump's fear tactics. I know that day for me was so inspiring, seeing from, small children raising signs and leading chants to, our elders out. It was a beautiful day. And next time we need to grow even bigger and more powerful. That's just the reality. So there's a ton of work that needs to be done to build trust, to engage with our neighbors and community members in order to create a culture of action, to get to that critical level of participation that we need, that 3.5%. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So we want to be clear about, once we have that people power, how do we wield it? How do we make sure team democracy wins? At the ACLU, we're working on a multi-pronged approach to protect our civil liberties. That includes fighting in the court. You've probably seen our lawsuits. They're pretty impressive. It includes making sure public attention is on priority issues And it includes holding elected officials accountable by making President Trump's abuses of power unpopular across the broadest coalition possible. So we like to call this disrupt, delegitimize, and defect, this strategy of ours. It's the 3 Ds. So around disruption, we disrupt authoritarian agendas and delay abuses of power that undermine civil liberties in the courts, the streets, on the Hill, in the state legislatures, and in the media. Second D, we delegitimize the regime and create public and political backlash to make government abuses of power too costly to continue, forcing the administration to reconsider harmful actions. 3, defection. Research has shown that one of the most impactful counters to executive overreach is when members of the leader's own party, when they're friends, stand up in opposition to them, right? So that's why we're organizing with constituents. I know some of you, I've been organizing with you to put pressure on elected officials to defect, to say, no, sorry, this is too far. So all that to say, at the ACLU, we have a plan. We have the facts of history at our back, and we know how we need to grow as a movement in order to confront the authoritarian threats that we're facing right now. And we know that we need you with us. We need your neighbor, your pastor, your imam, your friend Becky, your grandma. We need all of us to join our team democracy and build our people power. And like I said, tonight's training is just the beginning of this conversation that we are having with you all. And in the next few sessions that we're offering, we're going to get into the skills, the concrete abilities that we need to do that essential organizing work, to bring in your friend, to bring in your coworker. So see you there. And with that, I'll pass the mic back to Attiya to share about some next steps that we can take together.
Hi again, everyone. Just gonna spotlight myself. Thank you so much, Asha, for moving us through such an informative presentation. I hope that we're feeling informed. I hope that we're feeling fired up. And as someone in the Q&A box shared, you are strong, you are resilient, and you can do this. I think that's such an important mantra for us all to take with us as we leave this space tonight. But first, let's talk about ways that we can get involved and take action. We know that knowledge is the first pit stop in our journey to be a part of a movement, to build movements. And the second pit stop is getting involved. So the first way that you can do that is joining our People Power volunteer team. Our volunteer team consists of tireless volunteers who are working 5 days a week and more to make sure that we are able to turn out rapid response, to make sure that we're able to take action and get folks engaged. So you can get involved with our volunteer team by going to aclu.org/volunteer. And then the second step that you can take is getting involved with your local affiliates. This is the best way to get involved in your local community, see what's going on right in your doorstep, right in your neighborhood. And you can do that by going to aclu.org/affiliate. Again, your affiliates are a great place to start taking action because they're closely connected to organizing on the ground on issues that are affecting you directly in your communities. We talked a lot about voter registration. Voter registration on a local level is so critical. I live in New York and my friends and I talk about it all the time, and we've signed up constantly to help people register to vote. So one way that we do that is through the NYCLU. So make sure that you're getting involved with your affiliates. We could go to the next slide. So this was the first part, just part one in a very long series of how to get involved and how to learn to organize to protect democracy. We have exactly 4 sessions in this series. And while we just are completing and on the verge of completing session 1, we need to make sure that we're signing up for the next 3 trainings. These 3 trainings are going to help us continue to build our strategic brain, continue to develop and hone our skills, and teach us how to really connect with our community community and to mobilize and lead in such a critical moment. It's also a great way to stay involved in your community, to stay involved with the ACLU, and to continue checking in and doing gut checks as you build this knowledge. So make sure that you RSVP to the second session in our virtual training series. It's happening on August 7th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And again, that link will be in the chat. One of our staffers is dropping it there for you, and we'll also share it in your follow-up email. So again, please sign up for the next training in this series. We don't end the conversation here, and knowledge is an ongoing process, and we're all going to learn and build power together. If we could go to the next slide. Awesome. So now we're at the portion of this conversation where we get to talk about some of the questions that y'all have had. So one of the first questions, Asha, that we've been getting is particularly about if there's one thing that you can do every single day. What is that one thing? And how do we make sure that it's a consistent practice?
Amazing. Yes, I love this question because we have an answer. So we have that amazing people power volunteer team that Attiya had just mentioned. Maybe we can make sure that that link is shared in the chat. Y'all, we have the most amazing volunteer leaders at the ACLU. So we have, I'm just, Julia, Mesha, Marcy, I can't name them all, but they log on every single day and work on the most urgent campaigns that the ACLU is running all across the country. So one day they'll be sending texts about Medicaid to voters in Colorado. The next day they'll be mobilizing for a really important town hall in Maryland. So this is something that you can do every day from home. You log on to our Slack, and you can sign up as either a texter or a caller. Shout out to the people who love to phone bank. We need more of you. And you can make, just 5 calls a day. You can spend half an hour a day, or you can spend several hours. It's up to you. It's a really flexible volunteer opportunity that we can offer.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Asha. Another question we have, and many of the questions that y'all have been sharing have been sort of about rapid response and how we build resilience. So could you share a little bit about how we balance making sure that we're staying resilient and not burning ourselves out and still responding to these moments that are necessary for rapid response?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's such a good question. I think a really important ingredient to long-term power building, to long-term organizing is celebration, is celebrating the wins that we have. And that doesn't mean necessarily a policy win. Okay, so I just want to use that example of the Medicaid campaigning that many of us have been doing over the past few weeks, right? We didn't get the legislative win, but in the process, just for example, in Colorado, we had volunteers organize their own protests, drop flyers in their neighborhood, drop in on their representative's office, and in so doing, brought in tons of new people into our movement. So, if you compare our power now versus a month ago, we're in a much better place. We're in a much stronger place. And so we need to celebrate that. We need to celebrate the new people that we have and honor them and make everybody feel how important it is to take action, even when we don't get that specific policy win, right? Just showing up, being together in community is an amazing thing and is deserves to be celebrated. And that way we can also have fun and want to stay in this work together for the long haul.
That's so great. Thank you, Asha. Sort of on that note, I've seen a lot of questions about apathy. How do we combat apathy in, the apathy that we see at our workplaces, amongst our friends, or in our community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think real, genuine, deep relationships are another essential ingredient to organizing, which I believe is in some of the following sessions of this training series that we have here. And I think what really helps me when I'm feeling apathetic is having just a genuine conversation with a friend, especially if it's an organizing friend, right? Because they might understand why I'm feeling so down today, because we've all seen the news, right? And so what I would encourage us all to do is, as we're taking part, maybe it's, in people power, maybe it's in your local activist group, is really try to build real relationships with the folks that you're working with, get to know them. There's that key organizer rule around you should be listening 70%, 5% of the time versus talking. So spending the time to build relationships with folks, that way you can really rely on each other when things are tough and not just fall into apathy. When we're in community, we always care, right? Because we care about each other. We care about our friends and family who we're doing this work with.
I love that so much. I definitely see you as one of my organizer friends, and in my moments of apathy or feeling isolated, when I'm seeing the news, I know that I can turn to the folks that I work so closely with to feel secure and just to remember that community is important. So that's such a good comment, such a good insight, Asha. Another question we have is just more broadly about, how do we build the power with folks who have differences? So how do we build coalition and get people to put their differences aside so that team democracy can win?
Yeah, I'm gonna just go back to that same rule around listening more than talking here. And so again, this is covered in the training and the training that hopefully you all will be at in the next few sessions. But when I'm trying to talk with somebody who I know feels really different about something than I do, especially on a key issue, it can feel hard, right? It can feel hard to bridge that gap. And the best way to start to build a relationship is just by having an open conversation, getting to know the person, getting to understand their motives, getting to understand their values and what they do care about. Because often, even though it may seem hard to believe, we can find common ground. We can find those common values with folks, even if they vote differently than us, but it takes some time to get there. Once we've established trust by building a real relationship with somebody, then it's much easier to have those difficult conversations about the things we disagree with, right? If we're just accosting a stranger on the street saying, you don't believe the same thing that I do, you're wrong, versus going to somebody you've built some trust with and having a conversation with them, asking, why do you feel that way? And sharing your own perspective, that leads to a much more productive place. And you can really bring people along. I've been organizing for 10 years, and it's amazing how just a few genuine conversations with somebody can really help bring them along on a variety of different issues.
Definitely. Another question that we're having is, what do we do when our elected officials aren't listening to their constituents, when they're diametrically opposed to everything that their constituents are saying? How can we actually create change in those moments?
Yeah, well, I want to bring us back to that slide around the players in team democracy and civil society. We are, I'd say, the most important players in team democracy, right? Everyday people like you and I. And so if our elected is not listening to us, what we can do is ensure that every single one of their constituents knows that they're not listening to us, right? Knows that they're voting the wrong way multiple times. So, for example, last week, we did mobilizations across the country to representatives some of whom we knew we weren't going to change their vote. But through the work we did, we reached everyday people. We reached our neighbors, our community members, Becky, we reached all those people and we told them, this is how your representative has voted. How do you feel about that, right? And by raising consciousness amongst constituents, then we have the power and the potential to be able to change the future of our elections, to be able to change who does represent us in the future.
That's so important. Thank you. I am seeing a lot of questions about sharing a recording. So just to flag for y'all, yes, we will be sharing a recording of this presentation. You'll receive it in your inboxes, your email inboxes tomorrow. So just make sure that you check your inbox tomorrow and you'll get that recording. So don't worry, you will receive this training in your inbox. Another question that we're getting quite often is specifically about the Supreme Court. So how do we protect ourselves in a moment where the Supreme Court is leaning towards decisions that are so authoritarian? And what can we do to fight back when we don't really have a say in that?
Yeah, well, I want to do a shout out to our people power action calls that we have regularly. I'm not sure if we can share the next one in the chat soon, but at these calls that we have, we often talk about what's happened most recently through the Supreme Court, and then have an active mobilization ask for everybody who is on the call to participate in. Because even though, we know that the Supreme Court is supposed to be this, isolated entity that makes decisions based on their own calculations, what history tells us, what reality shows us, is that they are definitely influenced by political pressures, right? And by political pressures, again, that includes us in team democracy, right? So what we do, what our advocacy does, really does matter. Even though, of course, in this current situation, we're not seeing the impacts right away. Again, we're building that political change that we need in order to be able to influence decisions in the future.
Definitely. I think we have time for just one or two more questions. So one more that I'm seeing is specifically about voting, and if we could discuss voting as a means of resistance or consideration for these moments of democratic backsliding.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it's hard to overstate the importance of voting. And I always think back to remembering the Black liberation struggle, and remembering how hard folks in this country throughout history have fought, literally lost their lives in order to have this crucial power. And of course, we all understand that we know how it feels to vote for somebody, have them not win, to feel like our vote doesn't matter. But this is this really critical, essential tool to a democratic society that we cannot let go of. Our communities have fought too hard for it. And it is really a protected way that we can take part in our democracy, that we can make it so that we actually do have a government for the people, by the people. And I will say that, voting isn't just voting for the president, right? In all of our elections, there's all these down ballot candidates that we need to take account for. And we can also think about voting in the broader sense, not just for election. What about not just for those big presidential elections? What about our school boards, right? Those school boards have incredible power, have incredible sway over things like that we care about at the ACLU, like freedom of speech, like LGBTQ rights, right? Like surveillance. So we need to take advantage of all of those institutions that provide this democratic opening for voting, and make our voice matter, make our electeds listen to us at every level of institutionalized power that we have in our communities.
Definitely. I think our final question for the night is from one of our friends here who mentioned that they're an introvert and that a lot of the tactics that we've talked about tonight seem to be more so for extroverts. As an introvert myself, I sympathize and empathize with this question. So I'll turn it over to you, Asha, to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm definitely an introvert too, so I do feel you. And I say that we need everyone. And that's because, number one, even if you're an introvert, you can organize. Organizing is great because there's rules and there's tools, right? I mentioned that 75 versus 25% of talking earlier. That's a rule that really helps me when I'm trying to have an organizing conversation with somebody. Even though I'm an introvert and I feel weird about talking to others, when I have those rules in mind and when I have that purpose in mind of fighting for change, of fighting for what's right, it really changes the equation. And then what I'll also say is that we also have a lot of volunteer opportunities that are perfectly catered to introverts. So we've got, with your local affiliate, if you reach out to them, they might have a research job that you can do. They might have a graphic design job that they need help with. There's so many different tasks and tools that we need to do in order to deploy that 3D strategy that we talked about earlier. It's really not just talking to people, although don't give up on that. There's so many different things, so many different skills we need. So please think about reaching out to your local affiliate and finding out all those nitty-gritty ways that you can contribute to this movement.
Thank you so much, Asha. This has been an incredible presentation. I know I learned a lot. I hope everyone else feels the same. I want to remind y'all of our 3 big next steps. So number one, make sure that you sign up to volunteer or connect with your local affiliate. Number two, make sure that you sign up for session 2, that's going to be in August. And number 3, make sure you fill out our post-training survey. We are always trying to grow and make sure that our trainings are helping you be the best organizers and activists that you want to be. And so any feedback that you have will be critical to us as we continue to build this training series. So make sure you fill out that training survey. We will be sharing it in your inboxes tomorrow and in the chat. And thank you all so much for being part of this space tonight. And I will see y'all in August. Thanks, y'all.
See you next time.